Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Paul Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. This is one of 3 episodes dedicated to the celebration of the 125th anniversary of Drexel University. Each episode will be devoted to a term inscribed on the Drexel University insignia: art, science, industry. The current episode is devoted to science, and we're pleased to have 2 guests with us today. Bernard Amadei, the Mortensen Endowed Chair in Global Engineering at the University of Colorado and co-founder of Engineers Without Borders, and Michele Marcolongo, Department Head and Professor of Material Science and Engineering at Drexel University. Bernard Amadei, Michele Marcolongo, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, pleasure.
Well, Drexel University has a tradition of linking theory and practice and being attuned to the applied nature of various fields. And when I think of engineering, I think of it as the consummate applied science. Would you agree with me on that?
I think so. It's really taking basic science, what scientists do best, and put it into practice. And I would add to it, it's about improving the life of the planet, and it's about people. It's making the world a better place.
So the human element is always...
I think the human element is an integral part of what engineering is about. Otherwise, it becomes too much of a science.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think engineering is a way to translate those scientific discoveries toward problems that society faces, whether they're global environmental problems or healthcare problems or just advancing, getting at the best new app. You know, they all come from that engineering process.
Well, you both are poster children for different facets of engineering, as I see it. Bernard, you have a deep concern for how engineering affects people, communities, particularly underserved communities. I wonder if you would address how it is that you became interested in this particular facet of using your skill.
That's an interesting question. To make a long story short, is about 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Belize and visit some Mayan villages. And one little girl in one of those villages was carrying water from the river to the village, and they asked me, hey, you're a civil engineer, can you do something about it? So it was interesting because the problem was presented to me from a social point of view, not from a technical point of view. So I said yes, and went back there with, a few years later, with some students, and we did a little bit of fundraising and installed a pump, which was unique because it tapped into the energy of the river. So it did not use any electricity or fuel. And that was really the start of Engineers Without Borders at the time, about 2001, 2002. And 10 students came along with me, and then Engineers Without Borders grew very quickly, sometimes too quickly. And now we have about close to 16,000 members.
So you must have been primed somehow to respond to this need. There must have been something in your own background or your own temperament that felt a call when you went to Belize. So I wonder what that was.
I always wanted to be of service. So this idea of being of service to society started well before we started Engineers Without Borders in the US. I was doing some work as a volunteer here and there.
Where were you born? Where were you from?
I was born in France, and I came to the US in 1979 to do my PhD at UC Berkeley, and moved to Colorado, Boulder in 1982. So this idea of being of service was kind of in my DNA, and I think that the trip to Belize in 2000 was the first time where this call to service and my engineering education converged, and so I could do service through engineering, and that hit me. It was a life-changing experience. Yeah, I was about 40 at the time, so I was about 47, 48 years old. Call it midlife crisis, but in this case it was a midlife awakening.
Awakening, yeah. Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit with Michele, because you are a woman in a traditionally male field, perhaps less so now than before, but still when we think of engineers, we do not generally think of women, unfortunately, although there's been a push in this country for more female engineers. And I wonder about your interest in engineering, and we'll get into some of the particular ways in which you've pursued the field. But as a young girl, what drew you to the field?
Well, I was always kind of interested in creative solutions. I like, imagination and creating new things, innovating new things. And I always was trying to figure out how things worked around the house, wherever I went. I had a grandfather who was an amateur inventor himself, who invented a way to have an artificial heart, among other inventions that he had and patented. And it just inspired me to pursue.
Do you think having a mentor, a grandfather in this case, is very important for a young woman going into a field that's a bit non-traditional?
Oh, I think mentors help everyone get along. It's always great to work with someone who has some experience and is a little ahead of you.
But it's interesting when you say that you were interested in being creative and problem solving and how things work. That could have taken many different forms.
That's true. But I guess I also, in school, when I learned physics, I really became impassioned with that subject. I loved physics and mathematics, and that in combination with the creative problem solving kind of led me down an engineering path.
Were there teachers that particularly encouraged you?
Yeah, my physics teacher in high school was very encouraging. He was a great comedian, and he always made learning fun, even though it was probably one of the most difficult subjects that I had in high school. And that really made me think that it could be fun.
We are trying to juggle two particular perspectives here. One, you are very much in academia, working in a commercial area sometimes because you've started 3 companies, co-founded 3 companies. And Bernard, you're constantly moving back and forth between, it seems to me, the academic world where you teach and the world of communities that you serve. So I wonder about this coordination of interests. And perhaps, Bernard, you can talk about how it is that you're able to get people to work with you. The red tape involved in what you do must be enormous.
Yes, at times it can be enormous, but I've discovered that using a stealth approach.
What is a stealth approach?
Well, you go for it and you apologize later on, I guess. I think you've got to be bold and courageous, and as long as what you do is based on integrity and honesty, I think it is my obligation as a faculty member, as an academic, to explore some new horizons and new ideas. And then so I never got into trouble, but also I had promotion on tenure when I did.
You had tenure when you started your
when
work.
I started. So there was a safety net there. But I've always liked the idea of going forward into engineering, looking at new initiatives, almost like a scout, going ahead of the pack there, and ask people to come over. I mean, whether they come or not, well, that's their choice. But I think that this idea of being creative, going to areas like, what Drexel is doing right now with peace engineering, that Dr. Joe Hughes is launching here. These are really exciting topics. And as you get older, at least as I'm getting older, it's important to have in my life exciting topics. I don't want to get old.
Exciting topics that can have an impact
Absolutely.
On the world.
I think for me, it's really the human dimension of engineering that is driving the work that I am doing, making the world a better place, not in a generic term. It's that how can we improve the life of 4 to 5 billion people whose job is to try to stay alive by the end of the day.
I wonder, you talk about the university has never blocked you, you had tenure. What about other forms of obstruction? I mean, big global interests, big companies, big money, and so forth. Has that ever been a problem? Because you're dealing on a smaller scale. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that you might brush up against other interests that could be in the way.
Not really, because big money has never been a problem of mine. And the projects that we do are so small that I think big corporations are not interested, and which is on one hand, they don't bother us, but on the other hand, I wish they were interested because they have essentially the power to make some big changes in the world. Not really. Obviously, there are some bumps on the road. But all in all, I think that they have not been critical to the work I have been doing over the past 15 years. And if there are some bumps on the road, I can look at them as obstacles, but I also can look at them as opportunities to do something better.
Yeah. I think that's actually the temperament of the engineer. The obstacle is the challenge, to do something better. And I think about you, Michele. I know you have started companies, but you're also an academic. And so is this similar to what Bernard was saying, the desire to sort of break out of the confines, the conventional confines of engineering within the university and do something new?
Well, in a way, yes, that is exciting, but I think I have something else in common with Bernard, and that is the humanistic, caring component of that. When we make a discovery in the laboratory, and I work on biomaterials and solutions for people with injuries or diseases, when we have that innovation in the lab or spark, we can write academic papers about it. We train our students about it, around the topic, which is what a traditional academic does. But sometimes, again, you can see an application to the real world where if I can get this into a clinic, into a surgery, I can help hundreds of thousands of people with this one device that I've made in the laboratory. And so that desire to really get this solution back to society, that's the motivator for me.
You want to see that end product.
I want to see them get some use out of all that work that we put in, if it makes sense. Not everything makes sense that way.
I guess things are dead-ended, right, in the laboratory.
Yeah, some things are not really geared toward that. They're more exploratory, but occasionally there's
It is interesting that you're dealing with the human, the biomedical, and you're dealing with the human on the level of community, which is, I think, an interesting contrast. I wonder, with you, because it's a company and you're a nonprofit, Michele, some of the ethical issues attached to translating the pure research. The academic world is supposed to be an ivory tower where nothing it penetrates that isn't pure. And to commercialize has always been a source of some controversy. I wonder how you address that.
I think that idea has evolved, for sure. There was the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 that, in fact, encourages universities to patent their discoveries and then, get them out to the commercial world in a way. So most of our research can be protected in that way, which gives it some value to industry. And having that value to industry is a kind of a carrot to them, because if there's a technology they can kind of protect in a way, then they're more interested in developing it and then actually getting it to the people who need it. So otherwise, the way that the world works, at least in the biomedical treatments, it's very unlikely that would happen, and that it would.
So do you start with a need that you perceive out there, or that is essentially a market, and then work on getting that market?
Yeah, engineering kind of does that.
I guess that is engineering.
and
maybe that is the difference between pure science and engineering.
Right, absolutely. The pure science may be just discovering what happens when I mix these chemicals together, but in engineering, if I say, I really like to have a molecule that does this to help that condition, now how do I mix these molecules together to get it there? We're still mixing things together, we're still making things, but with a little bit of a different objective. The
idea of coordinating people, which I guess engineers also have to do. You have to be able to herd cats, so to speak, right? Organize across difference, both university people, researchers, and others. Is that a challenge for you? You both lead teams, so to speak. And what does that entail, being a leader in that way for a project?
Dealing with people is the most difficult part of any project whatsoever. I mean, if you're on the planet for at least 20 years, you know that very quickly. In the case of the work that I'm doing, I'm dealing with different types of systems, and infrastructure obviously is very important, and environmental system, but human systems and economic systems. And human systems are extremely dysfunctional at times, especially when you cross cultures.
Yeah.
If you work in a small village in Africa, you've got to deal with people who don't think like you, don't act like you, have a different culture, speak a different language, and so on. So coming up with some engineering solutions to, say, a problem in that community requires, yes, the technical stuff. But that's really not the most important part, is how am I going to work with the community in understanding the needs of the community? How am I going to work with the community in collecting data about the community? How am I going to work with the community in designing solutions? And how is the community going to help in putting those solutions in place and build something, say? And how is that community going to maintain that solution over time? That's extremely difficult.
So are there any tricks, I know it's very complex, but are there any particular tricks that you've come across over the years that help you insert yourself quickly? I mean, you have to do it with some relative speed and ease to get it done within a time frame. What are your secrets?
Are my tricks? What are my secrets? I don't really have any secrets. I think the first secret is humility. I think it's very important to be humble in that process. Number two, you cannot rush anything. I think patience is certainly a very strong virtue to have there. Understanding, listening. And I think that you mentioned the characteristics of leadership there. And what is a leader, right? I mean, how do you define a leader? There are several books that have been written on the topic. And one book that I found useful was written by a gentleman who was a Jesuit for, 20 years or so, and became worked for Goldman Sachs after that. And he looked at the Jesuit order that has been in existence for 400 years, and he said, well, what has kept that organization going for 400 years? And he comes up with 4 characteristics of leadership. One of them is knowing oneself, knowing thyself, this idea of knowing what works for you and what does not work for you, your biases. We all have biases. Your strengths, your weaknesses, and so on. So that's the first part. The second one, I think, has to do with, from what I remember, it has to do with being bold and courageous. This idea of, okay, there's a problem there, we're going to solve it. The third one has to do with passion. This idea of, I think that what has driven me over the years has been passion.
And that communicates itself to others, and they become
very much. It's
impassioned.
Contagious. It's contagious across cultures. I think passion has no language whatsoever. And if you see someone who is passionate and you see someone who is not passionate, you cannot define it in form of an equation, but it's something that it's in the DNA, right? And I think, and the last component is the idea of empathy and compassion. This idea of you're doing something for somebody else because you want to improve their livelihood or well-being and so on. One could spend hours on what is leadership. It's ill-defined, but you see it. We know when you see it, and you know when you don't see it. Let's put it that way.
And you know when it's working for you,
yes,
for your team.
Yes, and it's not easy. I mean, I've been to some places that are psychologically disturbing, what I saw. And you have to process that also. Having a mentor, as you mentioned earlier, I think is very important, or mentors. It's also very important. It's not an easy task. This idea of being a scout ahead of the pack, going into the wild out there, you've got to have passion, you have got to have the right tools, you have to have the right attitude. Because
and
it's
I
not
guess
easy.
judgment.
Judgment, and the idea of knowing when to go back and when to move forward, let's put it that way. But I think it's personal judgment, which you get over time with experience, because you make mistakes.
Yes. Can you add to that, Michele? Because you've dealt with projects that must have been quite challenging, that you wanted to launch with teams that might have been a little recalcitrant.
I think the same thing. You have a passion, you have a drive to get something to well, for in my case, a patient population that is suffering. And when you can have a common focus around an end goal, then everything you do when you back up, you can always go back to what are our founding principles? What are we trying to do in this objective? And then every decision that you make, every little bump that comes up, you just have to think, we need to get here. How is this decision going to help us to
Can you
advance?
give us an example of a particular device or a technology or whatever where that process was in play for you?
Maybe the first company we had a lot of people end up working on that as we got going through the process. And so some are more aggressive, they want to go into the clinic faster, some are more conservative, they want to make sure everything is absolutely and totally perfect, and somehow managing the two competing perspectives, but still being safe, but still being a scout, and you're going into someone's, to do a surgery, so you have to make sure everything's right, but there's only so much you can do outside the lab, outside of the clinic, so managing these competing kinds of
I guess
approaches.
not being a perfectionist always, being willing to deal with what will work.
Which we fight all the time because engineers feel like
how perfect to be.
But so managing these competing perspectives, everybody wants to get to the same goal and they all want to do it in the same way, get a treatment to the clinic, to the patient. But there are different approaches, so communication and just reminding everybody that this is okay, this is what we're trying to do, we're all working toward a good objective.
Well, I want to take a broader view now and ask you a question that really concerns me, and that has, as engineers, what you think about the crumbling infrastructure of this country and what we can do about that, or why more isn't being done, or what as engineers you feel needs to be done when and how important it is that we seem to be in such, well, to me, such dire straits in terms of our roads, our bridges, our buildings. Is this something that you've thought about, Bernard?
I've thought about it. I don't know if I can do anything about it, though. The problems are not really technical, in my opinion. I mean, I keep saying that all the time. If all the problems in the world were technical, we would have solved them by now. I think in the case of the infrastructure in the United States, it's mostly political, I would imagine, and we certainly have the money, the resources to fix the infrastructure if we want to, and we have to, especially, if you think about the future of the United States and the world over the next 10, 20, 100 years. I mean, infrastructure is critical to economic development, human development, and so on. So I think that it has nothing to do with the engineering. It has to do with non-engineering, non-technical issues. But having said that, I think that the engineering profession is faced, especially in civil engineering, with an interesting challenge, which is how are we going to design structures for the next 50 years, 100 years, maybe 50, let's put it that way, where I would say the context is changing, especially if we look at climate change, right? One can argue whether climate change is anthropocentric or so on. But the bottom line is that we are observing some very big variations in climate. How are we going to account for that in our design today? How are we going to design structures that are not static in time, but are actually adaptive in time? We don't know how to do that. So the same way as in the past, design was done in a very optimizing way, now we are forced to go into more reflective practice, adaptive design. And
do you think there is a system in place within the engineering profession, or as you say, there's a political dimension and social dimension to this too, to make this adaptability possible? I mean, I'll ask you, Michele. I think that's an interesting point, that we're not thinking of just fixing things, but thinking about changing the whole model of how we think about building things.
It's changing the mindset. It's really changing. It's a new paradigm. It's a paradigm shift. It's not a Band-Aid.
But that requires a a global thinker, a more conceptual thinker about these issues.
I think it's a lot of maybe what Bernard does now, which is bringing a lot of different groups of people together around solving one problem or addressing one issue, a societal issue, the communications part of it, and the really prioritizing as a national need. I don't work in building infrastructure, but I interface a lot with the medical infrastructure of the country.
And that also needs rehauling.
Which could, I would agree, would also need some rehauling, and just the dichotomy between something costs, twice as much at this hospital as it does at that hospital, and the whole way we bring people through the medical system. We're collecting a lot of data now, so there's a ton of data that's available, but we're not exactly harnessing it yet, so we need to figure out how to use that toward good and not just toward record keeping as a be-all, end-all. And so I think there are many challenges, both infrastructurally and in the
well, we're actually out of time. I mean, I could go on with you two for much longer, but it seems to me that the university may be the place that we can look to for hope for some of this understanding of the paradigm shift that you both are talking about. I want to thank you so much. You've been enlightening.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.